Here's William Lane Craig to tell you how much he thinks atheists' lives suck.
Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? In the name of progress, modern man has tried to answer those questions without reference to God. But the answers that came back were not exhilarating.
Because that's totally how you judge the truth of an answer, by how exhilarating it is.
But dark and terrible. You are the accidental byproduct of nature. There is no reason for your existence. All you face is death.
Really, I don't face anything between now and death. There's just nothing for me to do until I die. There's nothing for me to look forward to and nothing for me to enjoy.
Modern man thought that in killing God, he had freed himself from everything that repressed and stifled him.
I'm not convinced of this. I don't think anyone believes that freeing yourself from authorities who claim to speak for God frees you from all authority altogether.
Instead, he discovered that in killing God, he had unwittingly killed himself. For if God does not exist, man's life is ultimately absurd.
Of course, what constitutes absurdity is at least somewhat subjective. It's not clear that calling something absurd is anything more than an expression of incredulity. Conclusions about the truth of a premise that are based on one's incredulity of that premise are fallacious.
If God does not exist, then man and the universe are inevitably doomed to death. Like all biological organisms, man must die. His life is but a spark in the infinite darkness, a spark that appears, flickers, and then dies forever. Scientists tell us that the universe is expanding, and as it does so, it grows colder and colder. Eventually, there will be no heat at all. There will be no light. There will be no life. This is not science fiction. If God does not exist, then we are inevitably doomed to extinction. Now, what does all this imply? It means that life itself is absurd.
Craig seems to be using the term absurd interchangeably with ugly or depressing. That has nothing to do with the truth of any position. Craig's perspective is that the prospect of everyone eventually dying is sad. I, on the other hand, think the idea that everyone's ultimate destiny is either an eternity in hell or an eternity in obsequious submissiveness in heaven is depressing. That is the ultimate purpose that Craig believes is so preferable to death, to spend an eternity glorifying God.
It means that the life we do have is ultimately without meaning, value, or purpose. If each individual person passes out of existence when he dies, what ultimate significance can be assigned to his life? His life might be important relative to certain other events, but if all of the events are ultimately meaningless, what can be the ultimate significance of influencing any of them?
I find this point to be rather petulant. A person's relative significance could be that they have an impact that lasts for thousands of years, maybe more. But a life that is so consequential that its effects can be seen for millennia is not enough for Craig. He makes it sound as though a life which is not eternally significant is altogether worthless. This seems to me like a really petty thing to complain about.
Mankind is thus no more ultimately significant than a swarm of mosquitoes, for their end is all the same. This is the horror of modern man. Because he ends in nothing, he ultimately is nothing.
Yes, what a horror that a life that could be remembered for millennia isn't remembered for eternity.
But it gets even more distressing. For if life ends at the grave, it makes no ultimate difference whether you live as Joseph Stalin or as a Mother Teresa.
Again, Craig talks about the fact that there's no ultimate difference as though it's the same as there being no difference at all. The fact that all suffering ends eventually does not mean that it is irrelevant how much suffering there is now, or how much suffering you cause. Yet Craig talks as if the relevance of this suffering is, at best, negligible, because no matter how bad it is, it eventually ends.
If your destiny is ultimately unrelated to your behavior, then you may as well just live as you please.
I do live as I please. Apologists kind of tell on themselves whenever they assert that living as you please means being a horrific menace to other people. And even if living as you please does mean mistreating other people, it is obviously not the case that you may as well live like that, because even if our lives are finite, you are not going to live that finite life as well as you otherwise would if you behave that way. People who live that way tend to have pretty miserable lives.
Moral values are either just expressions of personal taste or else the byproducts of biological evolution and social conditioning. Who's to say whose values are right and whose are wrong? Now think of what that means. It means that it is impossible to condemn war, oppression, or crime as evil. To kill someone or to love someone is morally equivalent.
And even if there is a God, there's no non-circular way to issue an objective condemnation of any act. To say that we ought not commit an act because a God says so leaves open the question of why, objectively, we ought to do what a God says. Craig has said that the reason we ought to do this is because obligations arise as a result of imperatives issued by a competent authority. But what objective measure is there of an authority's moral competence? If there is such a measure that exists independent of a God, then a God isn't necessary to make objective moral judgments or issue objective moral condemnations. If the objective standard is God himself, then the argument is circular. And who says that we are obligated to follow the commands of a competent authority? If that obligation exists independent of a God, then a God is not necessary to the existence of at least this one moral obligation. If we are obligated to obey a competent authority because a God says so, then the argument is circular. I don't see a way to avoid some form of Euthyphro dilemma. Mentioning the absence of an objective moral standard if there's no God is not just silly because there's no objective moral imperatives even if there is a God. It is also an attempt to poison the well. It is an attempt to frame the position that there is no objective moral standard as equivalent to moral indifference. It is an attempt to make people that say, for example, there's no objective standard by which theft can be judged to be wrong, look as though they are saying theft is okay by me, or we shouldn't judge cultures that commit theft by the standards of our own. None of those follows from the rejection of objective morality. Not believing in objective morality doesn't make you any less appalled by theft, or any less opposed to it as someone who does believe in objective morality.
Our predicament is that it is impossible to live consistently and happily with such a worldview.
Then how have I managed to do it?
The atheist philosopher Bertrand Russell held that moral values are simply expressions of personal taste. And yet Russell admitted that he could not live that way. He therefore found his own worldview, and I quote, incredible. I do not know the solution, he confessed.
If Russell's view is being portrayed accurately here, then he's making the mistake of conflating all subjective intuitions together as though they all have the same consequence. They don't. My taste in fashion or music or literature simply doesn't motivate me to praise or condemn with the same force as my moral conscience does. I think they're both subjective, but that doesn't mean that there isn't an enormous distinction between the two. Saying that they're both subjective or both matters of taste makes it sound as though they are comparably consequential, and they are not. A moral conviction is not just a matter of personal taste, indistinguishable from having a favorite color.
If death stands with open arms at the end of life's trail, then what is the goal of life? Is there no reason for life? If its destiny is a cold death in the recesses of outer space, then the answer is yes, it is pointless.
Again, the fact that there's no eternally consequential point is not equivalent to there being no point whatsoever. Yes, any point to living that you choose is going to be relative and finite, but relative and finite points are still points. They still matter. They can still be monumentally consequential.
We need to wake up and understand the gravity of the alternatives before us. If God exists, then there is hope for man.
Hope for what? An eternity of servile, submissive praising? Why would I hope for that?
But if God does not exist, then all we are left with is despair. Faced with an atheistic worldview, the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre realized that life is absurd.
But a life ultimately devoted to glorifying someone for eternity? Totally not absurd. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.